Welcome, everyone. Nick Ottinger here with Team Conti Sim Performance in the Xfinity series, bringing you guys the Pro Track Guide for this week. So, pretty unique track, frankly. You have a corner in turns 1 and 2 that we're going to be lifting, possibly braking us for as well. And then on the other side of the track, you have a really momentum based side of staying in the throttle and being committed. More than people realize. So it's definitely a track that carries two different unique styles, and our job, obviously, is to be the most efficient in those two styles and maybe adapting to some other techniques. So this week, I'm going to let this play through for the first 5 laps, and I did a 30 lap run here, as normally I do in these videos. And I'm just going to let this play through for the first 5 laps, and on the 6th lap, I'm going to let you guys understand what I'm looking for, what I'm doing driver wise, what the car's doing, dynamically, and where we need to keep the car optimal, and maybe some challenges that may come along with it. So, that said, I'm gonna let this play through. This is obviously 30 lap run in our testing weather that you should have in our notes. So, if you guys want to compare and use that, that's what we will be using for Sunday's test session as a group. So, that said, I'm gonna let this play through. All right, gentlemen. So that's 5 laps. Just letting it play through. Now, some things you guys notice, some smooth tendencies of turns 1 and 2, and more of some bumps, splitter action in turns 3 and 4. So I want to dissect our exit of the quad oval here. Okay. So I'm gonna let this play through. Just a small pace here. Now this is the exact spot I'm thinking near the start finish line to this point where you see I'm stopped on the screen. I'm trying to determine where I want my peak of corner entry arc to be. So I want to find the point. Do I want to be right near the wall? Do I want to put the right side flush to the wall like we normally would at every single track? Or do I want to have the front end pointed sooner. And this is some of the characteristics of Texas Motor Speedway. You can have that quality, you can have a wider arc to your turn one, or you can shallow your entry so you're actually getting it to get to the white line sooner, so you're acting more grip to the left right near that painted white line. Okay, so very important to dissect where you want to get to the peak at the wall, or if you want to use the peak to where your left sides are just touching and crossing the dash lines that you see here, or do you want to just have a lower entry and cut under somebody to make sure you get the front end pointed? So this is why this track is very unique in turn one, because this is the corner on your corner entry to turn one where it's going to dictate the rest of your track lap time. Because if you overshoot it of your turn one entry, it's going to come from how big of an arc you're carrying right here. You can see I'm not pointing to the wall already before the AAA logo. I'm not pointing towards it. I'll use this as a reference to where this might be where I want the peak of my corner and angle to be at when turning away from the wall. And it's important here because, again, it's much different than Legacy Texas, much different than a lot of turn ones that we have at intermediate tracks, to where you really got to focus on, okay, I just need to focus towards angling my corner as early as possible or as efficient as possible. And to do that, you don't want to shortcuts too much, and you don't want to turn late, turn into turn one. So you're taking entry speed away, entry momentum, which is very key to just find this portion here of your cornering and setting it up for turn one, making sure we're going to actually dissipate the least amount of minimum speed and pinpoint where we want that minimum speed to be. And this is something that's going to ebb and flow through the track, through situations of behind a car, in front of a car, and also once we get tire temperatures up, you might have to change this approach up too. So that said, I'm finding my point again. I don't really want to have my peak be right at this logo or before it. I want to make sure when I start my lifting phase, I'm creating a lot of ability of the front end getting down into the corner optimally, down into this compression zone, and not too heavy either. I don't want to go in there and just overshoot entry and feel like, okay, I'm tight. And as a driver, I've had obviously years of experience on the sim. Like, if I'm driving into the corner tight at Texas here, I know it's majority of what I'm doing of entry speed wise. And if I'm lifting early enough, I'm lifting quick enough, and also angling my corner from this section all the way down into the compression zone. So as you see, I'm not adding any brake right now. I just have a pretty long distance of a rolling phase at turn 1 to 2. So I'm going to let this roll slow, and you can see I'm all the way off the gas, and my wheel input, you see it looks straight, but that's because I angled away from the wall, and I'm in a rolling phase now. I don't need a lot of wheel input just turning me down to this white line right now. A reference you could use is before this Texas logo. You obviously want to gradually turn into the corner. And why that is important is you're not adding too much wheel input, adding potential to the front to slip, and the other avenue of just the car being responsive and the front pointing so quick, and then you having to adjust the steering wheel and counter steer it to where the rear is actually breaking free. So really focus on your lift point and angling into this section, and with that in mind, making sure you're not overshooting this lifting phase all the way down into your compression, because an arc is very important at this track. It is very important not to arc it too much, because then you're having to take too much speed away, and that minimum speed we talked about, you're going to have to take too much away because you're having to wait on the front to turn. So too wide of an arc And not slowing down your entry enough is gonna dictate to where you might actually, in turn, through turns 1 and 2, overshoot, your center speed because you're carrying too much potential. So you see this, we're getting ready to go down into compression zone now, and I'm still off this throttle. I'm just angling down, finding this point where once I get to this turn 1 Texas logo, I'm thinking about how I need to maintain my apex angle, how long I need to maintain that apex angle. And it's important for Texas here of making sure we're having that quality thought about often. And why that is because we don't want to just get off of turn 2 too wide and have to get back out of the throttle. Cooler track temps, we may have all the grip to hold our apex angle right down here. And you can see I'm crossing this. I'm really crossing this. I'll rewind this. I'm crossing this seam before I get to the turn 1 Texas logo on the wall. And I'm fully under it with the right rear tire as well and wheel as soon as the turn 1 ends. That logo ends. And now I'm starting to find that point where I want to wrap my apex. I can have a shallow entry and wrap the apex as long as I want, but this is an important quality to remember. This weight line will have some grip. The closer you get to it, better off you'll be. But finding that point where you're going to stay on that weight line for that distance of what we're talking about, the apex, there are some key points that you're going to see on your partial throttle that's going to help you feel like, okay, I got the grip. I can get back into the throttle more. Don't do that. I promise you, more often, if you just get back to too much throttle percentage initially, you're going to push the nose tight later into a run, especially through turns 1 and 2. It's important quality to remember because you got to have the car balanced, wrapping the apex and wrapping it as long as you know you should be able to do, and then driving straight up off the corner of turn 2 because turn 2 starts flattening on exit. So let's dissect this apex. You see my initial throttle? It's about 50%. Okay? There's going to be some good markers for you guys to use on how long to stay on this apex and stay keeping this left front activated really on this weight line. Once I get into this partial throttle, this is right before the billboards in the middles of turns 1 and through turns 2 of the O'Reilly Auto Parts. Partial throttle, I'm still staying partial throttle. It's almost a fixed point of 50%, 40%. And then you see this patch of asphalt that is going into this white line. Really good reference point here. And I'm going to let this play slowly, and you can see as soon as I cross that, that's the point where I know I want to still keep some grip activated to this white line. Now, it's much like old Legacy Texas. You're battling to keep your angle apex as long as you can with keeping momentum. And now you see a bend, which is this car is directly lined up with O'Reilly Auto Parts billboard at the end where the billboards end. And you can see a sharper point where it starts going back towards the left at more of a consistent angle. Okay? You see how this line is, and then it goes to a point. So try to reference this each time you're going through turns 1 and 2. This is a really good marker for you guys to understand, okay, this is where I will be adding more wheel inputs to keep my angle. And if I have a hotter track temp, this is where I want to make sure I'm having a car still turning and keeping the same angle as this white line is. You're keeping the car pointing and keeping the car's radius the same angle as this point from here goes to the exit, okay? And now you can see I'm going to actually use that a little bit of a counter steer because now I'm 100% throttle. Now I have the car pretty balanced, pretty gripped up, and I'm going to actually veer off that painted white line because now you're in a 100% throttle moment. You don't want to just keep the car down there. You don't want to break it free. The longer you keep that radius, sometimes, and again, depending on cooler track temps, depending on how the track tends. But cooler, you have all this grip and potential just to open the wheel up. So, like our testing weather has. And if you have that quality figured out around that point I just mentioned to you, to this, full exit, you're gonna be able to wrap this corner a lot better than folks because they're gonna be pushing the exit too wide here, and they're gonna be really breaking that slope that we have here, and then adding more wheel inputs at a higher risk ultimately in getting to the wall too early. So very important we have the grip to just exit turn two like we want. Have turns 3 and 4 very different than turns 1 and 2, but we just talked about turns 1 and 2 of how our entry is where we need to be reliable and not overshooting it, and making sure our exit of turn 2 is all about that momentum to turn 3, because turns 3 and 4 you're in the throttle heavily. You're not coming off the throttle completely for a majority of your race run, and that's just the facts are the facts. That is it's almost like you know, if you guys know how Kansas was for us, that's the quality of what you're running, like the top side of Kansas. You're doing the same type of approach of partial throttle, letting the car settle, and then wrapping that weight line how you need to. So that said, let this get to turn 3. Our entry point to turn 3 is very key as well, depending on where you want to run. And our lifting rate, our lifting off the throttle rate. Is it a quick rate? Is it a smoother, slower process to get to our minimal throttle that we're going to run here? Or is it something we're just going to dump the throttle and then get right back into it? I can tell you, as you can see, I'm 100% throttle, and now I'm angling my corner entry before I'm even lifting. Important quality to remember, because you want to cross these dashed lines and make sure you're loading into this banking, because obviously you want to utilize the banking to help compress and be smooth with lifting into turn 3. But you can see how I'm angling with a wider arc and have all this potential when I'm crossing the seam early on to still stay full throttle. Now I cross the seam and I'm loading the front end into the banking here even more. And this point near the Texas 3 logo, you're going to find your apex angle. And me as a driver, I'm finding my apex angle, and all I'm doing at this point is I'm trying to make sure I'm not taking too much speed away. I'm not driving into this corner with, this banking here with full throttle and getting it tight. What I'm doing is I'm keeping the car balanced. I'm keeping the car's potential in there to where I'm not taking too much entry speed away. I'm not taking my minimum speed out of the car and then having to regain it later into the corner. I'm taking a smooth process of getting down to this weight line and using this weight line as a good reference. Now, tricky part is running this weight line, because this is the bumpier side of the track. This is the bumpier side where we're going to be in the left edge of the splitter. It's just, we talked about the uniqueness of the track. Turns 1 and 2, we don't want to have the car dynamically wrong. So a setup philosophy requires us keeping the car pretty flat in that section of turns 1 and 2, because that's where we need downforce. That's where we need the car to be optimal, and aerodynamics to help turn the car. And that requires turns 3 and 4. The more banking we have, the higher speeds, we're probably going to be in the left edge splitter more often than not. So some quality just to remember on what you're focused towards balance wise in this corner. And I'm going to rewind this just a bit, and you're going to notice my partial throttle. My partial throttle, 50% like my corner entry was, on my initial response of getting to my minimal throttle and maintaining it. If you guys remember, middle of turns 1 and 2, that was 40 to 50% on my initial throttle. That's when I know the front's turning, the rear's turning, in the same type of angle that I need. The car's gripping, so that's what I use as a reference. And here I'm working towards this angle, still wrapping this bottom 100% already. The first six laps I have that potential, but later on we're going to be pushing this full throttle moment later, and you don't want to clip the apron one thing you definitely don't want to do is clip that apron. And if you do, you're just going to shoot up here. So if you can exit low as possible, it's really good. You know, you don't want to cross this seam. I'll give you a reference. You don't want to cross this seam well before the Kroger logo. If you do, you're hurting yourself and maximizing, you know, your efficiency to the front tires and maximizing your exit momentum, because you're going to push tight off of turn 4 if you're running the bottom and exit that high. So just something to factor in. Now, I'm going to let this go to lap 20, and you're going to see a difference. You know, we're going to be 1.2 seconds off at this point by lap 20 on compared to our lap 6. So I'm going to let this play through, and you can see some reference points of how it's different now. We talked about I may be inducing some brake on entry into turn 1, and that's the only side of the track I'll be inducing it on. Once it works through turns 1 and 2 here, I'm going to rewind it, and you're going to see some qualities of it. Alright, let's go rewind. Now, much like we talked about early on, our angle here is very key. And now, as a driver, I want to make sure I'm getting the angle that I want. And you can see my rate, the angle that my wheel is, the rate at which I lift. You can see a pretty aggressive pivot with the front and point to the front. So now I have the angle that I want. I can enter shallow, or I can enter, you know, where I think I should, really above the seam once I load into this corner. And now my job is to manage my risk of entry speed. Do I risk landing into the corner at a heavier rate, giving more resistance to the front? Or do I get my entry backed up a little bit and slowed up before I add more max wheel input into this landing zone of where I know the front's going to be not at its optimal in turning, because going 20 laps to a run, tires are pretty hot in the front, and it's just building temperature and building pressure up. So now my objective is to this zone. As you can see, I use minimal brake. It's very minimal brake, but it's slowing it down. And you can see I'm not adding a lot of wheel input. Once I get down to my apex, you know, around Texas 1 logo, I'm going to be getting off that brake so I can have a rolling phase and then focus on my partial throttle. You can see in this whole process, I've been off the throttle after the brake, and you can see my wheel. I'm counter steering a little bit, got a little tight with the front. Now I broke the rear traction just a tiny bit, and that's just because I oversped entry a little bit, and I had to adjust in setting up for my on throttle side of the corner. As you can see, partial throttle, we talked about that point that I just went through, and then going back to full throttle. And you can see I'm counter steering exit a little bit and just going through the corner. So once this ends in turns 3 and 4, I'm going to let the last 5 laps play out. And you can see turn 3, partial throttle, still partial throttle. We're about 5 to 10% less than what I was lap 6 in our testing weather. And I'm going to keep this partial throttle and still keep it, still keeping partial throttle all the way to the, you know, ultimately until I get through these billboards, because those are the avenues of where the pumps are the most egregious, especially like right here before I get to the billboards. Really aggressive when you're trying to wrap this white line. As you can see, I break some traction here, counter steer it just a little bit, and that's just a quality that's going to happen. So, all right. So that's turn 4. I'm going to let the last 5 laps play out here, and you guys can see what you need to for 30 lap run. that is our Pro Track guide this week for Texas Motor Speedway. So, some final thoughts. Just again to reiterate, don't overspeed entry turn one. Obviously, you got to be committed. You got to understand where you're gonna factor in that minimum speed, and again, try to focus on your angle towards turn one. So that's gonna do it for us this week. Appreciate you guys tuning in.